Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's CECAN webinar. It's 1 o'clock, so we're going to get going. I'm Ben Shaw. I've been involved in CECAN as Deputy Director since its inception as a research centre in 2016. I'm now primarily involved in CECAN Limited, the consultancy that's been spun out of the research centre to meet the demand of some of the complexity-sensitive approaches we developed. For those that you don't know, or haven't joined us before, CECAN is the Centre for Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, which is quite a lot of buzzwords in a single sentence. But the aim is essentially to understand complexity in policy and evaluation. The aim, when we set up in 2016, was about transforming the practice of policy evaluation. We focus on food, energy, water, and environmental domains, and to make it fit for a complex world. We've been pioneering, testing, promoting innovative policy evaluation approaches with UK government departments. And there's loads of information on the website about how we've done that. We also capture that in some outputs, including an annex to the UK government's Magenta book on evaluation, handling complexity and policy evaluation. So that's enough about me and CECAN. Today, we got a very interesting set of webinar. It's about embracing complexity, using systems thinking to improve responses to child criminal exploitation. We're hopefully having some lessons from and for systems thinking in public service delivery. So very pleased, delighted to have Jo Reilly, who's here going to be presenting the webinar. I'm going to introduce Jo and then hand over to her after I briefly explain the format for the session. But Jo is currently a visiting scholar at the Centre for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge and has recently completed a Churchill Fellowship in New Zealand, looking at support services for those affected by sexual violence. You're previously a policy fellow at the Royal Academy of Engineering, looking at how to apply systems thinking to tackling child criminal exploitation, and a policy fellow at Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy, looking at serious and organised crime. And some quite interesting previous roles around being head of serious organised crime unit in His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, senior advisor in Prime Minister's Information Unit, and public affairs advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury. So even if we don't ask questions about the webinar, there are lots of questions we could ask about those interesting things. So the format, Jo will speak for about 40 minutes. If you've got questions you want to address, please submit those at any point in the question box, which you should be able to see on the Zoom webinar control panel. You're also able to upvote questions which you think are particularly interesting or you'd like to hear. So do put your questions in at any point, and we'll come back to those at the end. We will be recording the session, and it will be made available on the CECAN website along with the slides. So hopefully that covers all the introductory comments. I hand over to Jo now for the presentation. So welcome, Jo. Thank you for being here today, and look forward to hearing what you would say. So in about 40 minutes.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone for giving up kind of your lunch hours to come and listen. I really appreciate it. I'm aware we've probably got a little bit of a diverse audience here today, because I think some of you will probably be from CECAN and will know quite a lot about systems thinking and less about child criminal exploitation. And then there'll be people who've come along because they know quite a lot about child criminal exploitation, but less about systems thinking. And so I'm really hopeful that this talk will kind of cater to both and have something interesting for everyone. But we've got a time for questions at the end. And similarly, if you're not able to answer your question, or if something occurs to you afterwards, please really feel free to email the CECAN email address, and they'll pass on any queries to me, and I'll make sure I get back to you. And so I thought it would just be helpful to start with what's the definition of child criminal exploitation. Oh, wait. And also, what is the definition of systems thinking, and kind of go from there. So, and actually also, sorry, I haven't done a webinar before, so I'm kind of getting used to just talking into the void, but hopefully it will go well. I'm sure I'll adjust in a minute. But I just wanted to acknowledge at the beginning that this thinking is not all my own. In some ways, I'm a little bit of a magpie. I read a lot, I talk to a lot of people, and then I try and kind of knit it together into something that makes sense in my own head. So in terms of the system thinking, I've really used a lot from Donella Meadows, and in terms of kind of thinking about a systemic approach to child criminal exploitation, thought a lot about Craig Barlow. So if you find this talk interesting, I've put a suggested reading slide at the end, which kind of points to some of their materials, because I think they are really useful. So what is child criminal exploitation? This is Craig Barlow's definition, and it says it refers to the selection, recruitment, and control of a child in order for the child to commit crimes for and on behalf of another. And kind of key to child criminal exploitation is the power imbalance. So it's essentially, normally an adult, but sometimes another older child, kind of coercing, forcing, grooming a child to commit a crime on their behalf. It's worth noting that at the moment we don't actually have a statutory definition for child criminal exploitation, which means that across the different agencies involved, sometimes slightly different definitions can be used, and it's always worth checking in with the people you're talking to about what definition they are using. But the kinds of things that can be involved, it's quite wide. It can involve the production and the conveyance of drugs. It can involve forced labor. It can involve forced stealing or forced begging. It can involve asking children to hold weapons, transport weapons, hold money, transport money. It can also involve sexual exploitation. The kind of child criminal exploitation that a lot of people have heard about is county lines. And so county lines is generally where children have been used to transport drugs, generally from city areas to more rural areas, and then sell them. And that's become quite prominent over the last 10 years. I will not talk too much about county lines in this session today, apart from kind of two things to note. Firstly, it's really important to remember that kind of the business models and the types of child exploitation are continuously developing. So for example, like the term county line refers to the phone lines that used to be used to order the drugs. So someone would get a phone number up, they'd order the drugs, and then the child would bring the drugs to them. And in some cases, that's still very much the same business model, but we're also increasingly seeing the internet being used. Sometimes the dark web, but also just Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok. It's not uncommon for those kinds of things to be used. And I think the reason it's really important to note that very early on is that if we base our response on a very specific business model, our response will very quickly become out of date. The ways that children get exploited are constantly developing, and so we need to be flexible and responsive in looking at how the business models are developing. The other thing to note is that it's fairly common for people to talk about different types of exploitation as if they occur to different children. One of the things I hear quite frequently is this idea that criminal exploitation tends to happen to boys and sexual exploitation tends to happen to girls. The reality is it's far more complicated than that. Children who are being exploited will often experience multiple types of exploitation. To give an example, county lines, it's not uncommon to hear of something called plugging, which is where drugs are inserted into a child's anal or vaginal cavity for transportation. Now, that's clearly a sexual harm as well as a criminal exploitation. Similarly, unfortunately, because there is quite a large market for abuse images of children, sometimes you'll find that that those images are produced by people that don't have an interest in children, but are looking to cater to that market. And so again, that's kind of criminal exploitation as well as sexual exploitation happening simultaneously. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about how do we respond to these business models, how do we protect children, that we don't get too set into the specifics of the type of exploitation or the type of business model, to the extent that it kind of clouds our ability to kind of understand how things are evolving and emerging and changing and try and keep pace. When I was running the Serious and Organised Crime Unit, I always used to say, I see myself and my team as chess players and coastal engineers. We're chess players in that, we make a move and we have to already be imagining what the next move will be in response. And we have to be kind of planning ahead and thinking about the ways things might evolve and really kind of monitoring and considering it. And coastal engineers, because when we make some kind of intervention, say we shore up a particular place, we have to imagine where is the kind of the risk getting displaced to. If one bit of the coast is has been reinforced, the surrounding areas might get more of a battering. And so really kind of having that kind of long-term strategic approach to whatever kind of activity we engage in. And I'll talk about that a little bit more during this presentation, but I think it's a helpful framing to have. I think another thing that's useful to have in mind when we start talking about child criminal exploitation is children will not always recognize that they are being exploited. It's quite common, both with sexual and criminal exploitation, for a child to think that the person that is, or people that are causing them harm are their friends. It's quite common for them to feel that people that are concerned about them just don't understand the situation. And so I think as safe adults, we have to be able to recognize for children sometimes when they're in a situation where it feels likely that there is exploitation. Um, and the final point to kind of, before I move on to kind of talking about what systems thinking is and talking about what systems thinking means for our approach to child criminal exploitation, is to really just recognize that not all crime children are involved in or harmed by will be related to exploitation. I think sometimes what people who haven't worked with children's social services don't realize is that social services really evolved and were designed around intra-familial harms, so harms happening in the family. And it's only relatively recently that we've been really recognizing the amount of extra-familial harm in the community that's not necessarily related to anything going on at home. And it's been quite a pivot for social workers and the design of the system to try and cater for that intra and extra familial harm. And sometimes people will talk about extra familial harm and exploitation as if they're synonymous, but they're not. For a child that's getting exploited, there is someone, exerting coercive control or physical control over that child, and using them to commit crimes on their behalf. There are other children in our communities that will be involved in crime, or will be harmed by crime that won't be experiencing that dynamic. And I think it's important to be able to break those out and to talk about the different issues that need solving so that we don't accidentally overlook any child's kind of needs or circumstances. So that's kind of the brief intro to what child criminal exploitation is. And I'll just move on to kind of a very brief intro to what systems thinking is. And so for me, my introduction to systems thinking really came through the policy fellowship I did with the Royal Academy of Engineering last year. And it's really about trying to understand the problems we're trying to solve and then trying to design a solution which is more likely to address the core issue than the symptom. So when I try and describe what I think systems thinking is to someone that's never heard of it before, I think we're trying to work out how the structures of the system relate to the behaviors, and how a set of things are interconnected in such a way that they result in behaviors. And I think possibly the best way to explain this is like the metaphor of a football team. So, you have 11 people, and when they get on the pitch, they become a team. And when you're trying to understand how that team operates, you're not just thinking about the 11 constituent elements. You're thinking about, firstly, the interrelations between them. Do they have the same strategy? Are they able to pass to each other effectively? But you're also thinking about, do they share the same purpose? Because if someone gets on the court and thinks they're playing basketball, and another person gets on the court and thinks they're playing football, I should say pitch, sorry, but you're going to have a lot of confusion and not a very satisfying game to watch. So, the underlying purpose of the system is the set of rules that everyone has bought into about why they're playing it and what they're doing. So, the underlying kind of purpose of football, the idea is I want to score the most number of goals and avoid conceding as many as possible. And if you were to flip that and say, right, you win in football by conceding the ultimate number of goals and scoring the fewest possible, the ways those elements would be interconnecting and playing would be fundamentally different, and so when you're trying, I think what systems thinking is really useful for is it allows us to see what the constituent elements are, but then it also allows us to think, what is the relationships between them? What's the information flow? What are the feedback loops? And what are the underlying purposes? Why is the system behaving as it is? And the best way to understand the purpose is to really look at what are the behavior. So, if someone arrived down from Mars and had never seen a football game before, after watching a couple of games, I think they're going to be able to say, well, you win by scoring the most number of goals, because I've noticed that, the person that scores, really celebrates, and the person that concedes gets quite upset. So, you can tell what the purpose is just by looking at the behaviors. And when systems seem to be stuck in problematic patterns of behaviors, That normally means that somewhere within the subsystems there are contradictory goals, and people are pulling levers in different directions, and that means things are getting stuck. And I think that's probably a theme we'll come back to later in this presentation, because I think arguably that is sometimes what's happening with some of the different agents involved in trying to tackle child criminal exploitation. And so to kind of give a bit of structure to kind of the main themes I'm going to talk about today, I've kind of, it is more complicated than this, but I've kind of split it into 3 broad themes. Kind of, if you want to tackle exploitation, firstly, you need to kind of understand the vulnerability. What makes some children and adults particularly vulnerable to exploitation? How can we kind of reduce their vulnerability and protect them from it? And if they are already being exploited, how can we support them to a point where they're safe and they're no longer being supported, and also they can recover from what will have been a really traumatic experience? And then secondly, we also need to understand the criminal business markets and models, because, you know, this is not happening in a vacuum. It's not happening kind of willy-nilly here or there. What's, you know, we're dealing with a black market economy, and often quite a sophisticated black market economy. The thing that always struck me is, you know, if you want to work out how many drugs are in this country, you don't really need to look at the volume seized, because if you're looking at the volume seized, you don't really know, have we seized more because we're getting better at you know, at identifying them and capturing them, or have we seized more just because there's loads more coming in? It's really difficult to really extrapolate what's going on just from like kilograms seized. And so a good proxy for the amount of drugs coming into the country is the street price. Because, you know, generally with a supply and demand model, you know, if there's less availability of drugs, the price goes up. If there's more availability or it's stable, the price is stable, or the price sometimes can even dip. And COVID was a really interesting time, because you might have expected that that the price of drugs would really have gone up, because global supply chains were you know, massively impacted during COVID. But actually, from the best that we can tell, the prices seem to stay pretty stable. And then that indicates that that some of these organized crime groups had more resilient supply chains than like Tesco. Because, you know, at a point where we were all like struggling to get toilet paper, and, you know, we were really worrying about medicine shortages and stuff, the organized crime groups did not seem to have the same issues. And you know, there's a couple of different ways you can interpret that. Maybe they had large stocks, maybe the demand fell because people are at home and so didn't really want to be taking drugs in the same way. But I think it does indicate that we do really need to take very seriously the existence of the markets and the models, and it's not enough to just focus on the individuals involved. We have to try and understand the systems and understand, you know, what incentivizes it, how does it work, in order to start thinking about how do we make it less likely that that there's you know, markets out here that rely on the exploitation of children. And finally, the third element that I hope to cover kind of briefly today is really thinking about spaces, because again, exploitation is not happening in a gap. You know, it's happening in our communities, and it's happening in the shared spaces we all inhabit. And so I think that's something really important about thinking, like, what is it in our environments that are making it easy for people that want to access vulnerable children or vulnerable adults to exploit? What is it that is enabling that access? How do we kind of reduce access and remove some of the enablers in order to kind of do better to keep our children safe? So, and I think, you know, if generally when you hear about kind of national policy responses to exploitation, it's often very much focused on the top. You know, we're often talking about how do we protect individual children? How do we, you know, avoid criminalizing individual children? And I generally hear much less of a discussion about how do we understand the underlying criminal business markets and models that are relying upon the exploitation of children as kind of a key constituent element in their ecosystem, and how do we understand what it is about kind of our physical and virtual spaces and environments that are making it easy and enabling the exploitation of children. So hopefully we'll cover all of these points a little bit today. So starting with the first point, how do we kind of understand what makes children vulnerable to exploitation? I think the key thing I really want to say here is that it's really complex and very like context specific and person specific. And the reason I think that's really important to stress is that sometimes I've heard people say, well, we just need to understand like which particular set of adverse childhood experiences makes a child more likely to exploitation. Or, you know, we just need to kind of hone in on like the particular vulnerabilities, and then we can go and identify and safeguard all of the children that have those characteristics. And I think that's a real misunderstanding of what it is that that in reality makes someone vulnerable. But because we're actually looking at this much more complicated overlaying factors of risk factors, then with protective factors, then with environment, and then with the own individual child's coping mechanisms. And so I think once you start to really get into the reality of what it is that makes someone vulnerable, you realize it's going to be almost impossible at like a macro level to identify a set of characteristics and then design a set of interventions specific to that group, and think that that's going to really protect all children from exploitation. And the the kind of takeaway from this is really obvious, but also really quite difficult to do, which is that every child needs a safe adult in their life who will recognize the early changes in their behavior, changes like, you know, they seem more withdrawn, they're, you know, they're coming to school less, they've suddenly got more money, they've started to go missing for a little period of time, like, you know, these kind of early red flags that something is going on. And not only is able to recognize that, but knows where to take that. Because I think an awful lot of people, even if they were worried about a child, they're like, well, is it overkill to go to the police? And, you know, should I go to the school? Like, you know, can I contact children's social services? What do I do? And I think there's a lot of children who, you know, they would have adults that would help them if they could, but they're not really sure where to go, and they're also not really sure what to look for. And I think for us as kind of policy professionals and operational professionals, one of the things we really need to reflect in are the adults that have the ability to spot changes in behavior and have the ability to kind of have that kind of confiding relationship with children. They're often not the same people as those we identify in the systems we design. They're often not social workers or police officers. They're not necessarily teachers, you know. It might be more like the dinner lady, or it might be more like, you know, the person in the corner shop or the person in the fast food shop that you see once a week. You know, and I think we need to be much more imaginative about where the kind of the safe adults might be and how we engage them and how we upskill them to really know what to do if they're spotting something they're concerned about. And then the next bit that I wanted to say before I kind of move on to our other elements was really emphasizing that understanding exploitation requires us to understand coercive control, because you know, we have been aware of child exploitation for a long time now. Like, we've been talking about county lines for probably at least 10 or 15 years. We've been talking about other kinds of exploitation before that. And arguably, despite the kind of the media attention and the political kind of scrutiny and the political investment into it, we haven't really seen changes in the ground. You know, we continue to see children who are being exploited, actually, you know, facing criminalization themselves, facing sanction themselves. And that's probably, and it's partly because sometimes we do see the adultification of children, you know, particularly Black and brown children, you know, a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old. Sometimes it's difficult for people to recognize this is still a child. And so sometimes, you know, we get into very like blaming of their behaviors, and there's a lack of curiosity about what's the underlying drivers of them. But I think it's also sometimes there's a lack of understanding about the nature of coercive control. And the thing I would compare it to is kind of maybe how in the 1980s and the 1990s we talk about violence in the home and abuse in the home. You know, it used to be relatively common to hear people say, well, I don't understand why she doesn't just leave. And now we're much more aware that it's not that simple. The point of leaving is actually the most dangerous point. And the ability to recognize that you're being harmed, that you don't deserve to be harmed, and that there is somewhere safe to go and there are changes you can make. That's really difficult. Someone does not need to be standing next to you or in the room with you to be exerting coercive control over you. And once they've got coercive control over you, it's very difficult to break. And so if we want to see kind of national level legislative changes and policy changes kind of trickle down into real changes in operational practice. I think there's a massive job about upskilling people to understand coercive control and to be able to recognize that sometimes behavior that might initially seem problematic is actually symptomatic. That to create spaces where we're able to show that professional curiosity about what's going on. And that's not, and this kind of comes back to the system thinking. This is not about blaming the professionals involved. We can't just say, oh, well, if that police officer or that teacher was more curious, it's their fault. We haven't averted a bad outcome, or we haven't secured a better outcome. We have to think about the systems and the environment these people are operating in, and their understanding of what good looks like, the incentives we've set up in terms of what good looks like. Because when you're seeing patterns of behavior, and we are definitely seeing patterns of exploited children continue to being criminalized, we can't blame that on individual professionals. We have to take a structural look at the ways that we are kind of organizing and structuring our systems, the behaviors that we're incentivizing and rewarding, and how we're explaining what good looks like to people. And so now kind of moving on to understanding crime ecosystems. So, sometimes the way that we talk about tackling child criminal exploitation, people think, oh, well, we just need to go in and kind of, like disrupt the OCGs or, smash the gangs. And disruption activity on its own is unlikely to result in any long-term gains, in my opinion. Generally, you might be able to, as County Lines is an example, you might be able to seize some phones or shut down some online accounts and make sure that that particular line is no longer active. But if you haven't done anything about the underlying business model, you've just created a vacuum that someone else will step into. And so, we can't, how do we get out of whack-a-mole into something where we fundamentally change the dynamics of the criminal ecosystems? That's really starting to think about like better use of legislation and regulation for like the fundamental dynamics of those ecosystems instead of kind of like their symptomatic behaviors. And because I'm not a civil servant anymore, as of April, I can now say we really need to think about decriminalizing and legalizing some drugs. I think the Portuguese model has been a really good one about looking at how you can kind of reduce the profitability and the incentives in some of the illegal drug markets, which is likely to then go on and reduce harms. I think the other thing that's kind of really worth pointing out here is that sometimes when I talk to law enforcement, you'll hear them saying, oh, like there's the exploiters and the exploited. And it's this sense that there's almost like a two-tier business wrong, the victims and the perpetrators. That doesn't reflect the reality of life. Unfortunately, it's nowhere near that simple. We're talking about multi-tier business models. And in those multi-tiers, you've got a whole middle level that will have experienced exploitation. Some of them will continue to be experiencing exploitation, but they will also be exploiting others. And so I think sometimes instead of kind of talking about like a binary, like victim and perpetrator, it's more helpful to use language like someone that's experienced harm and someone that's inflicted harm, because I think it's easier for us to hold that actually you can be both at once. And when we're thinking about kind of what is our response, people have to be held accountable for harm they've done. It's important for them, it's important for the community, but there also has to be a recognition. Sometimes these will also be exploited children. And so we have to kind of try and get that balance right. And when we're thinking about how are we kind of engaging with and disrupting the crime ecosystems, we really have to be thinking about which layer are we targeting, and what's the the levels of culpability and also the levels of replaceability. Because if you're only targeting those very bottom levels, it's quite easy to just to have a conveyor belt of just bringing more and more children in, and you haven't really done anything to disrupt like the fundamentals of the system. Similar to this, sometimes disruption activity can displace risk rather than remove it. And so I'll give a couple of concrete examples here. So I don't know if you've heard of cuckooing. So cuckooing is where a group will take over a vulnerable individual's property and use it to kind of as a base where they produce and sell drugs from. And it's very traumatic for the individual involved, you know, be it a child or a vulnerable adult, to kind of have your home taken over, to sometimes experience violence within that home. Very, very difficult. And there was a police force who wanted to prevent cuckooing, and so they identified known vulnerable drug users in the area, and they started just doing drive-bys past the houses. And you know, and sure enough, the number of those individuals that were getting cuckooed appeared to fall over time. And initially, that was like celebrated as a success, like, oh, brilliant. And it was quite a bit later that a completely different set of charities started to flag. You know, we're really concerned that we're seeing much more elderly people and people with special educational needs having their homes cuckooed. We're not quite sure what's going on. And what had happened is in that making it more difficult to cuckoo the homes of vulnerable drug users had not removed the incentive to cuckoo, like, overall. It had removed the incentive to cuckoo those people. And so, you know, the individuals involved in cuckooing, that they're not silly. They thought, oh, it's going to be much more hassle to go and cuckoo that set of people. But unfortunately, there are a large number of vulnerable people for all kinds of different reasons. You know, you can be vulnerable because of kind of trauma, but you can also be vulnerable because you're lonely, or you can be vulnerable because you have special educational needs or learning difficulties. There's, you know, there's a whole set of reasons why you might be vulnerable. And if we are just focused on the results of one outcome, and we're not thinking about what are the focused on the results of one activity, and we're not thinking about the ripple effects, we really risk moving it to more harmful and hidden places. And so that means, like, I think there's a couple of key takeaways from that. Firstly, we really need to think about how do we monitor the impact of our activity? How do we make sure that if wherever the ripples are, we're likely to spot where they've been? And so that's really thinking about, how do we build evaluation in? How do we build monitoring in? How do we kind of plan out where that might go to and monitor it, and then learn and kind of review and learn from where it does move to? But it also means we really need to kind of make sure we are taking a multi-agency approach, because if the police had, you know, and it is difficult because obviously police need to be very careful that they're not spreading the kind of like you know, spreading too far ahead of time their operational tactics, because, you know, they're like, OCGs are very good at kind of infiltrating different organizations, and they could absolutely be keen to kind of understand what the police are planning and when. But having said that, you know, if some of the kind of charities had been aware that the police were kind of looking at the kind of vulnerable drug users' homes, and had been aware that that increased the risk that someone else would be tried to be cuckooed, it might have been spotted sooner, and there might have been like additional kind of protective measures that could have been put in place to try and safeguard the people where that risk was displaced to. So I think we really need that kind of multi-agency kind of planning, and the kind of the aligning of the priorities, and the thinking through not just of kind of the short-term activity, but the long-term outcomes from it, in order to really kind of see a step change in our response to exploitation. And finally, kind of like the third stem that I really wanted to talk about was the building community resilience to exploitation. So in some ways, you know, ideally, any child that's being exploited would have a response which enabled them to be kind of removed from that situation, you know, made safe, supported to deal with the experiences of it. Ideally, we would be kind of disrupting the crime ecosystems and kind of, you know, really reducing their incentives and their ability to exploit children. But then we also need to think about, how do we reduce the number of children that are easy to exploit? How do we kind of try and cut down that access to it? And we cannot be talking about child exploitation without be talking about child poverty. You know, sometimes when I'm talking to people that don't know much about exploitation, they assume that the kids that are kind of groomed in, you know, that they're interested in trainers or the cool jacket or the cool fashion. And the depressing reality, when, you know, when you talk to youth workers and when you read kind of case studies, is a lot of the children are trying to help their parents with rent and with food. You know, the cost of living crisis has had a huge impact on the young people in this country. You know, we're about to go into the summer holidays where children that would have been receiving free school meals, that support isn't necessarily there. And I know last year Bernardo's really raised concerns about what that would look like. But I think it's very similar this year. So, you know, if you want to reduce the number of children that are kind of vulnerable to grooming, there's something about how do we just reduce the number of children who are experiencing real deprivation. Similarly, like it's been shown that children who are not in education, employment, or training are more vulnerable to exploitation. And so if we want to kind of cut off one of the access routes to them, we have to be thinking about what kind of provision is needed, what policies are needed to reduce the number of children who fall into that category. Because, you know, when children have spaces they're expected to be in, structures they're meant to be in, they have kind of safe eyes on them. Kind of the same thing for children in care and care leavers. We know that that children in care or care leavers are often disproportionately vulnerable to exploitation, probably because of a lack of trusted relationships. And so, how do we start to really think about what support and additional care we give that enables that that reduces that vulnerability? And more accessible spaces for children to spend their free time. You know, I had my niece stay with me about 2 weeks ago, and it was one of those really, really wet days in June where you would have thought, oh, we'd go to the park, and you just, you know, you couldn't go out for more than 10 minutes. It was soaking. And in the end, I took her swimming, and we had a great time. But it really made me think, if I didn't have a safe home and I didn't have any money, what would I have done with that child? Because now in London, you might say, oh, get a bus, you can take children on the bus for free and go to the museums. And that's probably true in London. Firstly, I'm not sure that's what like children and teenagers want to do. But secondly, that is not true nationally. And I think sometimes our responses to child exploitation have too much of a London-centric bias because that's where a lot of the policymakers are. And we don't properly appreciate how for children and teenagers and young people in large parts of the country, there really is minimal infrastructure that doesn't require some kind of money to join. And so children that are just hanging around with nowhere to go and nothing to do, they are much, much more easy to access than children that are in safe supervised spaces. And so, you know, from a tackling criminal exploitation lens, there is a real there's a really strong case for trying to kind of like make more accessible these kind of spaces that children are happy to go to and want to be in, but mean that they're not out and about unsupervised and easily accessible to people with more malevolent intentions. And then, you know, the final things I would say is how do we make sure that there are more safe adults available to stop the spines of grooming and exploitation, and particularly those that might be coming into contact with children. So I was a school governor in Plumstead, which is just in Woolwich in South London up until quite recently. And we had this really horribly depressing phenomenon where older teenagers would stop some of the, you know, the 10 or 11-year-old kids on the way home from school and offer to buy them fast food. And when I heard this, because of my professional background, all of the alarm bells went off in my head. And I thought, I really think that this is like the start of a grooming attempt. And I thought, I wonder if the fast food workers know that, you know, if they're seeing like, you know, older teenagers repeatedly come in with quite young children and repeatedly buy those children food, are they recognizing that that's something a little bit odd? Like, are they recognizing that could be the beginning of debt bondage, where, you know, you've bought a child a couple of meals and then suddenly you say, oh, you owe me now? But because that's exactly how kind of coercive control starts to be established. You know, it's always this, we're your friends, we're nice to you, you belong with us, you know, we care about you, you matter here in a way you don't matter anywhere else. But also, we're a little bit scary and you owe us money now. You know, and it's always that double-edged sword, or not always, most of the time. And so people that are coming into contact with that might be fast food workers, that might be taxi drivers, that might be retail workers. You know, it's not necessarily your police officers or your social workers, or not even your youth workers always. So how are we really kind of building the community infrastructure and resilience to tackle exploitation by making sure that people that are coming into contact with the front face of it recognize it and have a sense of where to flag it? And kind of the same with children and caregivers. Like with the school in Plumstead, I really encouraged them to send communications out to caregivers and also to do an assembly, age-appropriate assembly to the children, saying, actually, if someone's offering to buy you food, even if you're hungry, don't take it. If you're hungry, come and talk to us. There might be things we can do. But you know, this is something that's something that you should be a little bit concerned about. And you know, you don't need to be terrified, but do tell us. And so I'm just coming to the end now. And I know that when we're talking about this, it can feel really dark and heavy because we're really talking about horrible harm coming to children. And I know sometimes it can feel almost a little bit overwhelming because, you know, basically I've said, well, as long as we tackle child poverty, address criminal business models, rebuild community infrastructure, you know, and improve our responses to vulnerable children who are experiencing trauma, we'll be fine. And you're like, right, that's all we need to do. And so I think it's really important to also take a step back and realize it's hard, but it's not impossible. And so for this, I'm just going to tell like a little bit of a personal story very quickly. So my family's Irish, and my dad's dad, my granddad, was born in 1888, and he was born in a house that had no running water, no electricity. They worked on the farms using, you know, farm labor equipment. And it had only been about 50 years that the first ever steam locomotive had been introduced. So, you know, like train travel was still really quite new at that time. And yet in 1969, we had someone walking on the moon. And that gap, I think it was a gap of about 130 years between the first steam train being introduced for passenger fares and a man standing on the moon. If you had said to someone at that time, oh, in 100 years' time, we'll be able to have someone on the moon, it wasn't just that people didn't know how to do it. It wasn't imaginable. It didn't seem in any way plausible. And so, you know, when we coordinate our activities, when we have a shared sense of purpose, a shared sense of goal with the right level of investment, humanity can achieve things that seem absolutely unimaginable. And tackling child criminal exploitation isn't unimaginable. We do know what we need to do. It's just really, really difficult to know how to do it, and really, really difficult to imagine how we can get there. But I really think we should be feeling hopeful and determined rather than overwhelmed, because we do understand the problems we have to solve. We do have the right tools to enable us to kind of come up with a structured response, and there is an awful lot of will to tackle these kind of issues. So I will stop there, but thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you, Joe. It's well, really fascinating, really interesting, and aligns with lots of those, you know, those intractable, tricky spaces that you need to go into. And if you look at the symptoms and try and, you know, play whack-a-mole, you're going to struggle. There are a few questions I've in the chat. I'm going to ask use my position as chair in terms of, you know, the system insights and realizing that, you know, you can't just look at symptoms. Symptoms are products of the system, and there's no single agency that's responsible and able to tackle it. How that system approach, seeing it as a bigger contextual problem, how's that gone down when you've raised? Are people aware of the need to do this, and is it the limitations of resources and funds, or is it a narrow sort of that's not my responsibility thing? What's your experience of talking to people in different sort of, you know, on the ground, in local government, in the local agencies, in national government? Do they see it as this? Is it?
I think there's absolutely a recognition that this is needed for a way forward. I think just because of the way funding stream works, it's really, really difficult in the current structures to imagine how we get there. But spending reviews and government funding streams, they're man-made things. They can be changed. And I think that I think it's important that we don't try and put the burden on professionals who it's just not in their scope to change. So when I was running the serious and organized crime unit in the prison and probation service, in large part, I was like, well, if we could just reduce the demand for drugs in prison, my job would be way easier because, you know, I can stop one access route into prisons. I can like put, you know, more security around the gate. But when the incentives and the profit to get drugs in are really high, they're going to start coming in deliveries, or they're going to come stumbling over the walls. So I always felt like wouldn't it be great, as the head of the Serious and Organised Crime Unit, to be talking about what's our drug treatment programs, what's our mental health support. And that was absolutely not in the remit of my job. Absolutely not. But it would absolutely be possible at like a treasury level to create some ring-fence budgets for complex issues, and to say that kind of money can only be signed off and spent when you've got the various agencies kind of signed up so that they'll do their bit with the money. I think the current kind of funding streams where essentially Treasury gives money to siloed departments, and then when each department receives their envelope, they decide how to divvy it up. It doesn't work for complex issues because, for example, like when you think about the Department of Health and Social Care, adult social care doesn't exist. NHS waiting times are through the roof. It's not surprising that talking about drug treatment in prisons, you don't make their top 10. And yet for prisons, it's huge. And whereas if you had a budget that wasn't being kind of allocated out to the departments, but was being held centrally for complex issues, it would probably be easier to gain momentum. So I think that people do recognize the problems. I think it's just important to take those problems to the people with the right levers. And generally that's not the people in the operational jobs. It's the funding streams, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I've got lots more questions, but I'm not going to keep going. There are a couple of questions in the chat. There's one from David Limna, I hope that's pronounced right. Wondering if you have designed a systems framework for this, so more about the way you've understood the system. So you've seen the problem as systematic, but whether you've got a framework that's allowed you to look into that system and sort of break it down.
A little bit, yes, but I will be honest, sometimes my concern is that when you start talking about systems thinking in these kind of spaces, what happens is you go into mapping and you create this really quite terrifying sheet with like 100 different agencies on, and you have the lines between them, and it feels really overwhelming. And it also doesn't feel very personal or human, because it's almost like this is the system and we're outside of it and not in it. And so when I'm trying to think about how we do the mapping, I'm much more interested in how do we understand the constituent agencies and how they interrelate to each other, and how they share a sense of purpose, or what their different sense of purposes are and their different incentives are, as well as having kind of the mapped out framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the system mapping we've done in CECAN is about the contextual factors, rather than looking at the institutional relationships. And you layer that on as a second thing, but a lot that's come out of the work is alignment around shared objectives is critical, and getting that. And that's what system mapping does for me, is that you often realize that people come into the room and going, well, I thought we were doing this, and somebody else goes, I thought we were doing this, but actually no, we're doing this. And that moment is where you get alignment, which is one of the main things that comes out of system mapping.
And even just trying to create a shared language. If we're talking about a vulnerable child, who are we talking about? If we're talking about an exploited child, who are we talking about? Because sometimes between the different agencies, you've got really quite different understandings of what that language means. Yeah.
Great. There's a question from Nigel Gilbert, who's our CECAN director. Yes, it would not be a moonshot to make youth clubs, scout groups, sports clubs available to all people. As you say, this could make a major difference. It'd be a reversion to what we had 50 years ago. Is that something we investing in public spaces for young people? Is that something which would be catalytic?
I think that would be huge. That there are so many young people who just have really nowhere to go. I think we have to be careful to make sure we invest in spaces where young people want to go. And so that is, really doing the proper kind of participatory research ahead of time. One of the things that drives me mad is sometimes you'll hear like, oh, every boy wants to be a footballer, and and every girl wants to learn about fashion, and it can be like this really reductive sense that's actually not really based on very much research about what kind of spaces children want to be in. But I think having somewhere to go and something to do, and and it being a safe space that you can access, and you're kind of engaged and and made to feel like you matter and made to feel like you're seen. It's huge. So yeah, and I think it's something that it's disappeared really quite quickly without us really noticing or discussing the fact that for many of our young people that those kind of opportunities are not there anymore.
Yeah, yeah. A few years ago, I did some research in Hackney with some Year 5 children and talked to them about the experience of living in inner city areas. And the Year 5 children had nowhere. They were really scared about being on the street, and they just had this hierarchy, which they articulated as, in their words, the people with mental health problems, the street men, the adults, the teenagers. And then when you got down to the Year 5 children, it was the boys who displaced the girls, and the girls, Year 5 girls, had nowhere they could go. But the thing that came up again and again and again was chicken shops,
Yeah,
where a safe place they went because it was warm, there was someone there to look after them,
yeah,
and there was food. And
yeah.
and that's completely went against all the stuff that a lot of other professionals are saying about we want healthy eating and all this thing. So
And
yeah,
that's also why it's not a coincidence that fast food shops have been seen as a recruitment ground for organized crime groups.
yeah, yeah. Great. Lucy Lloyd asks, which organisations do you see as likely to exert useful pressure on the new government on this issue? And it's jumped. And do you expect to see a better understanding of complexity and systems thinking inside the new government on this and other complex challenges?
So I mean, I'm very excited that we've got a new government. I'm particularly excited that we have a prisoners and probation minister that I think does understand the complexity of life and is really committed to rehabilitation. But I'm also aware that, the opening shots, like they are talking about child exploitation, which is great, but they're talking about tackling it in terms of introducing, more specific offences around it. And I don't think the reason we haven't made more progress on it is a lack of suitable legislation. I think it's much more complicated than that. I think there's something about, the operational people on the ground not understanding kind of coercive control and adultification and still criminalizing children. And then there's also just something around too many accessible vulnerable children, so that even as you try and protect some, there's a conveyor belt through. So who the organizations are that are likely to have real impact with the new government, I think it's we have a government full of people that have much more operational experience than ever before, and so my hope is that people like the Catch-22s of this world, Shift is a charity I'm currently doing some work with, charities that are working with children, that are building an evidence base of what in practice works to kind of bring to life the complexity of the issue. I'm very hopeful there'll be more space to hear that now.
Yeah, and do you think the change, that conceptual leap to seeing things as a complex problem and using systems thinking as a tool is a way of saving money, or is it inevitably a more expensive way of dealing with a tricky problem? Because a lot of people we talk to go, we haven't got any money.
Yeah.
So if you can solve the problem with a better technique in a cheaper way, that's great. But a lot of what we're doing ends up being very process intensive, and so on. So are there any opportunities there?
I think the problem is two things can be true at once. It can absolutely save you money in the long term and be more expensive in the short. I think if we were, I think that there is, for any of our big public services, there's a relatively small number of people that are very high intensity users. It's true of the justice system, it's true of the NHS, it's true of adult social care. The average person doesn't use a huge amount of those systems, but a small proportion of people who have much higher unmet needs use them quite intently. And if you are able to provide services which kind of wrap around those individuals and meet their needs, over time, I think there could be huge cost savings. We have children that cost this country well over £1 million a year just through placement costs. For a child that's on remand, or a child that's in custody, or a child that's under a deprivation of liberty order, the cost of the accommodation is massive, and actually it's often pretty poor quality. They're often not getting education, they're not getting mental health treatment, they're not getting substance treatment if they need that. So we're spending a lot of money for quite poor outcomes. If you were kind of taking a systems thinking approach and really understanding how do you develop services which for intense users kind of wrap around, meet them where they are, don't need them to kind of jump through loads of gateways to access it. I think the savings to the overall system would be massive, but it's
Yeah.
difficult because firstly, we don't really understand how much individuals cost the entirety of the system because no one owns the overall budget. We don't really commission services in a way that wrap around and meet the needs. And we tend to commission services for the average citizen instead of really thinking about what are the different cohorts and how do we meet the needs of the high intensity users. So it would save money over time, but whilst you were setting it up and establishing it, it would be more expensive during that kind of the parallel system as you get it up and running. And it would take time to see those gains. And, you know, we work to quite short political cycles. So kind of having someone that's got the kind of the willingness to wait and see the long-term gains, it's politically very hard to do.
Yeah, I've seen that in a number of system mapping exercises where the link to costs is very short and the link back to solutions is a more tenuous network of factors that come around and take time to deliver. There was a comment in the question, which I'm not just from Natasha Langelben, which she's I think in social work, there's a real understanding now about coercion and coercive control. You were suggesting perhaps there wasn't in your comments. But one of the big challenges is disrupting the perpetrator when young people are understandably not able to give evidence against them. And the modern slavery laws are rarely used. And I know the new government have said they were looking at this to make easy to hold the criminals to account. And so a direct question on that, but what if you want to comment on that?
I definitely agree. I think social work has a better understanding of coercive control than policing. I think policing are often the places where young children kind of like charging decisions are getting made and people that have been exploited risk becoming into getting criminalized. In my experience, I think you still hear language that's quite blaming of young people and children that have experienced exploitation. And sorry, what was the second bit of the question? I know I was about to say something else. Sorry.
It was to do with the use of modern slavery laws and whether the government's going to do more to hold criminals to account.
And
When
again,
children don't get, you don't want to drag children into the criminal
yeah.
system to give
And
evidence as well.
again, I think we need to be very careful in not setting up a binary. It's not always, you know, innocent children and hardened criminals. You've got children being exploited, sometimes by other children who have been exploited, sometimes by older young teenagers that previously experienced a lot of exploitation. And I think that's where sometimes it gets really difficult to kind of recognize that someone can have both inflicted harm and experienced harm, and that the ways to kind of how do we kind of rehabilitate everyone so that everyone is safe. And I think some of the legislation that's coming through is still playing into a relatively simplistic two-tier business model of exploited and exploiters, which I don't think matches the reality of what's going on.
Yeah. Okay. Conscious, we're running out of time, so it's passed me quickly. Just to highlight a comment from Alice Walton, which is about the Children's Society's work, Look Closer, which is to raise the awareness of child exploitation amongst those working in business likely to come across signs of child exploitation. And there's a national campaign with NTP and NCLCC. I'm not aware of those acronyms, so there's a link in the chat which I hope it may be worth or of interest to those.
I think that was the NCLIC is the National County Lines Coordination Centre.
Okay. Yeah, so that sounds like something worth for those interested in what we've been talking about picking up on. So great, we're just about out of time. So unless there's anything, I think we've addressed it in some degree. Oh, Alice says, sorry, that should be British Transport Police. In their income. We picked up most of the questions. We could talk about these for many hours more. It's been really interesting. So, and are there any final comments or points you want to make, Joe, or have you covered everything you want to? There's nothing you thought, oh, I wish I'd covered that.
Yeah, no, I think just because British Transport Police just came up then, I would just say it is all about thinking about where risk gets displaced to. You know, we've seen massive investment into British Transport Police to try to address county lines, but what's that's actually resulted is in children that are being exploited being transported more by private vehicles again. And actually, I think there's a real question about, from a harm reduction lens, is it safer to have a child on a train with other adults around, or is it safer in a private vehicle? And I think the whole time we have to be really thinking about the ripple effects of what our interventions do, because I think we can very inadvertently sometimes put drive risk more hidden and underground and therefore more harmful. But yeah, but thank you so much for your time. It's been really good.
Well, thank you. We've got 30 seconds, so it's nicely wrapped up. I'm going to wrap up now to say, first of all, thank you, Joe. That's really interesting, been really fascinating. Lots of things to pick up on and explore further. So very grateful for that. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for attending and listening today. We will circulate the recording and the slides around after the event. And if there are questions you have for Joe, do send them into the CECAN address and we'll pass them on. But thank you, everyone. And at 2 o'clock, we'll say goodbye. But thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.